fange trotzdem schon mal an, also auch an den YouTube-Stream, ihr könnt starten. Ja, herzlich willkommen zur 7. bzw. 6. Vorlesung unserer Ringvorlesungsreihe. Heute haben wir einen sehr spannenden Vortrag über oder einfach nur Feminismus und die Klimakrise, wie das miteinander zusammenhängt. Dazu sagt gleich Franziska auch noch was und wir werden auch gleich ins Englische switchen. Vorab aber noch einmal ganz kurz was zur letzten Vorlesung. Die ist ja ausgefallen, weil Dirk Knotz leider krank geworden ist. Eigentlich soll es in der Vorlesung um den IPCC-Bericht gehen, also den großen Weltklimabericht, auf dessen alle Wissenschaft fußt und die gesamte Wissenschaft irgendwie zusammenschreibt. Und so, es sollte uns zum einen darum gehen, Dirk Knotz schreibt selber mit am IPCC-Bericht und hätte was dazu erzählt. Und dann wäre noch ein Input zur globalen Klimakonferenz gefolgt, und zwar von mir, weil ich dort mit einem von uns vor Ort war. Und wir wollten so ein bisschen darauf eingehen, was sind die wissenschaftlichen Erkenntnisse und wie werden die dann politisch mit eingebunden oder eben nicht, wie wird darauf geachtet oder auch eben nicht. Das hat letzte Woche leider nicht stattgefunden. Das würden wir aber nachholen. Wir wissen leider noch nicht genau wann, weil Dirk immer noch krank ist. Wir würden euch sofort informieren, sobald wir da mehr drüber wissen. Was für euch vielleicht auch noch relevant ist, ist, dass die Vorlesung vermutlich nicht mehr klausurrelevant sein wird, einfach weil es jetzt so ein Hin und Her gibt und wir nicht genau wissen, wann die nachgeholt wird. Also ihr könnt aber trotzdem sehr, sehr gerne kommen. Ihr kennt Dirk Knotz vielleicht alle auch schon aus der ersten Vorlesung. Der ist ein sehr cooler Wissenschaftler, der einen sehr spannenden Vortrag vorbereitet hat. Und ich habe mir auch sehr viel Mühe bei meinen Input gegeben. Also ich würde mich freuen, wenn ihr da auch beim nächsten Mal dabei seid. Wie gesagt, wenn wir einen Ersatztermin wissen, sagen wir euch, wann das sein wird. Was auch noch wichtig ist, der Test sollte eigentlich heute starten. Den haben wir jetzt um eine Woche verschoben. Da habt ihr auch schon eine Nachricht zu bekommen. Da werden die Fragen zur heutigen Vorlesung dann mit drin sein. Der startet dann nächste Woche Dienstag und dann habt ihr wieder eine Woche Bearbeitungszeitraum. Aber genau, das heißt, der nächste Test wird sich um die letzten 3 Vorlesungen, also inklusive dieser hier drehen. Und danach geht es dann weiter und die Vorlesung von Dirk Knotz und mir wird dann wahrscheinlich nicht klausurrelevant sein, kommt aber trotzdem gerne. Wir halten euch dann auf dem Laufenden. Ja, wenn ihr sonst erstmal keine Fragen habt, würde ich jetzt weitergeben an Franziska, die unsere heutige Referentin vorstellen wird. Viel Spaß.
Yeah, hello everybody. Also from my side, I'm switching to English so that our guest today is able to understand us. Well, we are very happy that Professor Wendy Harcourt is with us today, and I'll just briefly introduce her. My voice is a bit sore today because I'm having a bit of a cold, which is also why I keep myself brief. But that's not that easy because Wendy has such an exciting career, coming from Australia to Italy and Sussex and ending in ISS The Hague. So there would be lots of stories to tell, but just as a very quick introduction. She is Professor of Gender, Diversity and Sustainable Development at the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, which is one of the hubs for critical social science, and she's there already since 10 years. Before, she was located in Rome for 23 years at the Society for International Development, and her research and especially her activist interventions are devoted to feminist perspectives, political ecology, and critical development studies. And some of her recent and widely quoted books are Political Ecology and the Economics of Care, Bodies in Resistance, Gender Politics in the Age of Neoliberalism, and which is maybe most closely related to the things that we are talking about today, Practicing Feminist Political Ecologies, Moving Beyond the Green Economy. Well, and in the current times and facing rapid political transformation, her works are important because she so much focuses on how a radical transformation can be achieved, both with respect to politics of care, women, and queer empowerment. So we are very excited to hear your thoughts and enter discussion. So for now, the floor is yours. And as always, please post your questions in the Q&A function, and don't hesitate to post them in German. We will translate them. So it's no worry if your command of English is not that good. We will take care of questions posted in not in any other language, but all German questions will be translated. So, and now without further ado, I'll hand over the word to you, Wendy.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Franziska, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited also to have a conversation. I'm going to start the conversation with these types of questions. I'll try to be as quick as possible in the sense of I'm keen to also be in dialogue with all of you. I wanted to, first of all, in a sense, position myself and talk about why I think it's important to think through gender and climate change. Then I'll be going through issues around economic power relations, what we can learn from decolonial feminist perspectives. And then, as Francisca said, I'm very interested in how all of this learning or understanding takes us towards repair and amplifying solidarity. What sorts of news stories can we tell? And I'm going to tell some of the stories around feminist degrowth and then these new imaginations towards collective care and radical hope. So I hope you'll enjoy some of the stories I tell, but I need to really, first of all, start with a confession. Because when I was asked to speak on ecofeminism and climate change, I immediately had to think, am I an ecofeminist? And is that actually the label I want to carry? And is it important to have these sorts of labels? So I did want to position myself, which I think is very important when you're listening to me, to understand that, yes, for the last 10 years, I've been an academic, but before that, I was very much involved in the sort of politics around post-development, thinking through science as something I had to challenge, ideas around political ecology. And I was really engaged in that more from a, let's say, everyday perspective and also a political perspective. And since the 1980s, as a student, very much involved as an environmental justice activist and also as a feminist. And most of all around the issues actually of how do I think through issues of environmental justice from the position as a feminist, but also through an embodied position. So what I called feminist body politics. And I think over the last 2 years with COVID and this growing awareness of climate crisis, I'm really turning away from the idea of labeling myself, and I'm trying to think much more about how all of those interests connect. Because I think most of all, I'm trying to learn to be resilient, emotionally resilient, with this deep sense of loss and grief that I feel about what's happening with climate, what's happening with COVID, but also to do so with a sense of hope as much as from a sense of despair. So having said that I don't see myself as an ecofeminist, I've gone back to some of the people I've learnt from who do indeed call themselves ecofeminists, even if I'm not calling myself one. So in a way, this talk I've seen as something of a challenge to try to bring the insights of ecofeminists, people like Val Plumwood, Silvia Federici, Miriam Ice and Vandana Shiva, who I read many years ago into and have of course been influenced by, and see what they offer in terms of insights to the climate crisis. And I'm doing so not because I want you to rush away and read all those books, although I can say that they're all worth reading. It's more that these are the sorts of people that are helping me cope with the crises we find ourselves in. So at least what I'd also like you to think is that I'm definitely a feminist for sure, but I'm actually writing from a collective knowledge that is trying to deal with these crises and this sense of growing urgency. And I think we need to be reading, thinking, being together in very integrated and diverse ways if we are going to, in an embodied way, really deal with the future. So having said that, as a feminist then, I take gender as a central social category that shapes cultural, social, natural, and nature relations. And what I'm interested in as a feminist really is how power relations interrelate. And that means how agency, knowledge, and politics shape the environment. So I just want to be really clear when I use the term gender that I'm not speaking about women's specific vulnerability to floods or loss of resources or rising seas, though of course there is that gendered vulnerability. So I'm not talking about some essence of woman or some sort of universal category of woman when I talk about gender. And I say that very deliberately because I'm very aware, particularly in the 90s and maybe 2000s, and of course also now, these very popularized images of women as the victims of climate change. Pictures of Indonesian women being swept away due to their inability to swim from floods or because their clothing entangled them in trees. These are the kinds of analyses we had. We have images of women, of widows struggling to find ways to earn their livelihoods, and they're stigmatized even further with desertification and the problems in South Africa. These kinds of stereotypings of Pacific women, their families being displaced by rising oceans, forced to migrate, losing their natural and cultural landscapes. And then all the horrific images we see of wildfires in Australia and California, and the types of tragedies that are very real. But for me, these kinds of understandings of gender, and particularly the ways in which they impact more marginalized people or more vulnerable people, don't really help us to understand the historical, social, and economic power relations that have led to this kind of vulnerability that have been experienced by racialized, poor, and marginalized people. And so for me, I really, as a feminist and somebody concerned about gender and gender power relations in relation to understanding crisis, want to move beyond these kinds of flat descriptions of suffering, because those kinds of descriptions don't help us think about what are the ways we can bring about change. So in order to look a little bit more closely at gender and climate change as a feminist, I first of all need to take up really the questions of economic power relations. And this is where Francesca has mentioned that, you know, I'm concerned to move away from the green economy as the way to understand or to confront, or what politicians talk about, mitigating climate change. And this idea that we can somehow rely on the market and technological efficiency to overcome climate disaster. Now, as I said, I'm speaking from a genealogy of a lot of important feminist thought. And here I've learned a lot from Krista Victoric, who is, I think, was at university. She's based now in Bonn and in Berlin. So she's German, so somebody that you might have heard of. And she really has critiqued the green economy's strategies of smart and sustainable and inclusive growth through all these greening of investments and industries. And she points out how climate change is really based on a financialization of nature through green commodification, with all this carbon trading and UN clean development mechanisms. And these sorts of green economy mechanisms have been twinned with technoscience and investments in technologies for resource extractivism, ranging from fracking to deep sea mining. And these have been becoming a substitute for natural processes such as, and they're also substituting natural processes through synthetic biology and nanotechnology. Now, we saw all of those discussions happening very clearly in COP26 just last 2 weeks. So in this sense, I've really been thinking through that this whole push to reduce CO2 emissions and climate protection through commercialization and privatization of land and other commons has been very damaging for these marginalized groups that we've been talking about. And this idea of climate change through decarbonization in the north has been based on agri-fueled value chains, which happens at the cost of food security in the global south and with adverse impact on women, peasants, and caretakers. In this sense, we have in the global north, corporates and global consumer classes get access to all the resources, biodiversity, and genetic diversity of the global south and its potential as a carbon sink. And local actors, in return for all of the financialization of their forests or land, receive neither rights nor decision-making power that would secure in the long term their livelihoods and well-being. So in we talking about gender and climate change, what Krista Victoric is pointing out is that economically marginalized women, peasant women, local farmers are targeted as part of a green growth, and they're being recast as flexible labor, providing ecotourism, and they're customers then for this microfinance for green innovations and green technology, as well as microinsurance for drought and other natural calamities. So they're being, instead of peasant farmers, women farmers, they're being put into this neoliberal concept of the economy as entrepreneurial resource managers and caretakers of a financialized environment. So in this sense, instead of being seen as the people who have been exploited, people whose land has been taken away, people who are being pulled into a market that is not benefiting them, they're instead in this green growth narrative being seen as players in the greenings of the global economy. And as Giovanna Di Chiro, another feminist who I've worked with, I've also worked with Krista, really underlines, this kind of response to climate change really ignores gender power relations and inequalities. Now, these are based not only on gender, but also on race, ethnicity, class, and also physical ability. So in this sense, this green economy narrative apparently speaks at including women from the global south, but it does so with this blindness to gender power relations in the context of global inequalities. So deepening our understanding of how gender is played out in climate crisis, you can see that these women from the global south are not only marginalized, but are being retold in a different narrative in ways which is even more exploitative and even more part of a kind of invisibilizing of the real roles that they play with the environment. So that's economic power relations. And I now want to turn to how we also have to look at it in relation to social power relations. And I think here, again, we go beyond the green economy logic and look at gender and climate crisis in relation to other forms of economies, the care economies, local livelihoods, sufficiency and subsistence, and non-expert knowledge of commons and rights of nature. And I think it's here that ecofeminism offers an important set of insights. So what I'm arguing here, that this green economy, which is really extracting resources, including the economic work of marginalized women, has actually also ignored all the other work that women do, marginalized women and men, but here I'm focusing perhaps on women, ignores the fact the care work that they do to maintain everyday life in all of society. This sort of care work is really taken for granted. But this care work, these relations of care, which are the material and physical processes that sustain ecosystems and human and more than human living worlds, is actually at the basis of the ways in which we are related and living together. And here I'm also influenced by Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who asks us to refocus on care rather than on growth, economic growth, in order for us to really change our views basically on almost everything in terms of our ontologies, epistemologies, ethics, and politics. So that on one level, care is deeply gendered and a time-consuming activity performed to support the bodily, emotional, and relational integrity of human and more than human beings. But in even a more profound sense, care is an ethical and political concept that recognizes that care is everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world. And it's exactly this deeper vision of care, the idea that we should value care, is a way to recognize our mutual interdependency and our need for sustainable and flourishing relations, which is at the basis, I think, of ecofeminism, rather than merely survivalist or instrumentalist ones, which I think is the basis of the green economy, which is driving the ways in which, in fact, leading to economic problems that have led to climate change. So for me, instead of the types of economic growth that we see being advocated at the COP26 and everywhere else, what we actually need is to be looking at caring economies, which are embedded in principles of cooperation, sharing, reciprocity, and intersectional environmental justice. So instead of greening the economy, we need to be sustaining livelihoods to ensure nutrition, ecological balance, clean water, secure housing, gender equality, and meaningful approaches to all forms of labor. So for me, this for me are the kind of key messages that I hear from different ecofeminists and ones that I've been working with. All of the people I've now quoted have been coming from the global north and have been working in allyship with people from the global south. But I also want to bring in decolonial feminist perspectives as another way to be learning about climate crisis and to think of ways in which we can really change the world to be more emotionally resilient, but also take up an ethical and political understanding of how we can face climate crisis. So just mentioning a few of these decolonial feminist scholars, Rosalba Icaza and Kalpana Wilson, Olivia Routarbois, who I heard just recently, talking about decolonizing development. I think what they're pointing to is that the whole climate crisis really means there's something really radically wrong in our way of living. And in that sense, it's not just enough to sort of bring in care and to rethink those relations. We also have to recognize the historical violence on which the ways in which we've been living economically and socially is based. And here I think I have to position myself as someone who is living and working in the global north. And I think that's also an important thing to say, that I'm having to really relearn and rethink with feminists coming from the global south from very different perspectives. So in that sense, as we take up the problem of climate crisis, we see a very deep and fundamental need to change the ways in which we're living that's based on a destruction not only of natures, but also of other cultures. And we have to understand how and why we continue to imagine a sort of technocratic, economically driven process, which actually has led to this catastrophic situation, and why we are still able to ignore the past and the impact of neoliberal capitalism and modern development. So I think climate crisis also makes us rethink our histories and where these violences are coming from, driven by colonial extraction of labor and also knowledge of the global south, as well as the resources. So I think, the things like green revolution in the name of fighting climate is actually perpetuating the idea that only knowledge that counts as Western, technocratic, economic-led development, and that the so-called other or non-Western lands, labor and knowledge are perceived as something as empty, plunderable, and scientifically ignorant. And that these are the peoples through development aid that are requiring technical support and need to be included in Western knowledge and economies. These are deeply colonial and racialized ways of understanding relations. So again, this is where ecofeminism is important, because it points to the way in which Western-centric, hegemonic, patriarchal and white imaginary of the world has erased other knowledges and ways of living with nature, so that we end up with what we consider legitimate knowledge in a very narrow, Eurocentric and exclusionary way. And this dominant way of thinking that actually undergirds the green economy, which has led to the climate crisis, ignores the multiple or pluriversal ways of living, and also ignores the messy and complex relationships of humanity and other beings that we ourselves are living through all the time. So in that sense, climate change concerns all of us, but it concerns us in unequal ways, depending on how we are positioned. And there is a deep fragmentation along race, class, gender, and ableist lines. Basically, climate crisis is an outcome of the modern colonial divide and the loss of cultures, natures, and ways of being that is impacting us in different ways. Now, for me, decolonial feminism invites us to push back against this dominant narrative and helps us to question who are the consuming, and who are the consumed. So those living with privilege need to rediscover how to learn to transcend the lies of economic development, listening to those who have learned to live with loss, recentering away from the hegemonic narrative, and seeking to recover our capacity of relations with life. So for me, this is where we need to really amplify how gender, but also racism, caste, and ableism are part of the climate disaster. And we need to support those who are resisting the hegemonic narrative. And resistance, I think, is rising everywhere. And this is also what gives me hope. I'll come back to that later. But I think my point here is that we need to listen and act in solidarity with others. And that for me is part of facing the climate crisis. Now, here in Europe, and I'm speaking to you from the Netherlands, and most of you, I think, are in Germany, we're really living in the belly of the beast. This is the headquarters of capital and fossil fuels. And we need to challenge the dispossession and the devaluing life in all its forms and be explicit in our fight against climate crisis in our anti-colonial and anti-extractivist ways. And in this, we need to work towards repair and amplify solidarity rather than reproduce mastery. So for me, in this sort of major task of working towards repair and doing so in solidarity, we need to change our ways of thinking, our desires, and our habits and ways of being with others. In other words, new relations of care. As I said, this is something that ecofeminism feels very strongly about. So it becomes not just our individual, but our common responsibility to care as a political and substantive work. And we need to do so as peoples concerned with overcoming intersectional oppressions that have arisen from what I think we must all agree is disaster capitalism, and that has led to the destruction of our earth. So for me, this process of bringing care to the table allows us to disrupt gender injustices and colonial continuities that shape a patriarchal capitalist society nature relationships. And for me, valuing care can then expose the deep gendered injustices, particularly for communities exposed and displaced by climate change and environmental destruction in the global south. As Giovanna Di Chiro again proposes, revaluing care means caring for climate, caring for the earth, and caring for people. And I would strongly agree with her, and I think most ecofeminists, in saying that this should be at the center of economic value, not at the margins. So centering the concept of care can help us to bring societies based on a commons of caring relations away from growth and towards well-being and equity. So again, to quote Puig de la Bella Casa, it's about collective survival within a world where many lives are more precarious than others. It's about solidarity and collaboration where caring is an ethically and politically charged practice. So if all of that is the ways in which we can rethink how climate crisis has come about and how we're living with it, this means we need to tell some new stories, because we don't want the green economy narrative, nor the narrative of the vulnerable, nor the narrative, the dominant narrative that we can extract nature without impunity. So in this sense, we need to go beyond mainstream discourses that climate crisis can be addressed through smart technology and universal agreements, such as, well, the ones that were signed in the COP26, not only because it perpetuates lies, but also because it erases histories and cultures. And also, when we're talking about how we can face this together, it saps our capacity for imagining and caring for other worlds and for recuperating past, presents, and futures. So I think it's crucial that we begin to understand the profound impact of Eurocentric racialized colonial capitalism on our lives. And climate crisis points to how we are actually living the loss of histories and cultural meaning. So we need, by telling other stories, produce small resistances that can speak to our imaginations and to the possibilities of transition as we learn to listen to the many experiences of climate from a position of what I call radical hope. And for me, telling stories is therefore paying attention to the ways in which we're always already making worlds with others and asking how we might do so with care. Now, I don't know for you, but I know I've been told that speaking about collective care can seem impossibly utopian. It's impossible. We can't be telling all these other stories. It doesn't make sense. It's something that is just an imagination that is unreal. But I think it's just as unreal as these opposite dark messages of crisis and doom. And I think that telling stories, our own stories, small stories of possibility, are very important, because stories of how people are thriving, flourishing, living their lives, it can produce tangible evidence of where care matters and how relations of care can and will change and the importance of valuing care as an ethical and political practice. So in this sense, one major thing that I think we can all do is listen to the many experiences of hope that are happening, and in this sense, build a collective care with others. And this means really intentionally trying to engage with positive stories and think about our ongoing relations. And in a way, it's this ecofeminist idea of a collective embrace that's embodied, material and emotional, and where we link ourselves, communities, natural and social worlds. So one of the stories that I'm starting to enjoy telling and being part of a collective care approach is feminist degrowth. And this image comes from a recent conference that was held here in The Hague and also online, which looked at caring communities for radical change. That was our slogan for the conference, or our title of the conference. Now, degrowth itself is a very provocative slogan because it goes to the heart of capitalocentric, anthropocentric, and Eurocentric oppressions that stay invisible in mainstream economic norms, which dominate most of our lives. So degrowth points to the need to reduce consumption, to recognize that we are in crisis now, and that we need to really change the way we're living because of the madness of growth. And it's also a way to try and understand how we can move to a world where crisis actually says we have to act. And it's a systemic challenge based on the different knowledges about how we can learn to live simply so that others might simply live. And in this sense, again, it's part of this thinking positively so that we can become part of the change we want to see. In other words, practicing a prefigurative politics. So for me, one of the stories I'm interested in being part of is the degrowth narrative, which is embracing all of these different issues that you see there in the slide. Then I think I'm also really wanting to speak about other possibilities of really becoming part of different and new social arrangements where a reproductive commons would take into account new social arrangements of care and the reproduction of life. And I think this is where communities in Europe could actually be learning from the global South, which has survived colonial intrusion at the margins of capitalism. And for me, that's really trying to listen and learn from their stories. And in that sense, then scale out as we rediscover our societal relations with nature. This is very important, I think, given we're living through COVID times where there is a deep sense of crisis and fear. And even though we might want to acknowledge that sense of hopelessness, it's also very important that we look to building our communities and think about how we can start telling new stories which go beyond the green economy. Yeah? Okay, so for me, that main thing is that we're learning to listen to different resistances, not as an individual and not just individual actions, but in collective actions so that we can start living well and learning to be a community and learning to live from non-Eurocentric ways of living. Now that's a huge challenge. How can we be part of a pluriverse set of communities and part of the environment around us? That requires us to unsettle or dismantle all those racialized economic narratives and going below the tip of the economic iceberg. As you see there, that's an iceberg that the Community Economies Research Network have worked with as a way to take back the economy, where you see all the different types of economies below the mainstream economies. And by looking at all those ways in which we work together, we can also build awareness of our collective responsibilities and actions. So that's a major step, to find stories of radical hope and listen to the resistances and differences in solidarity and allyship and care. And this is where I'm quoting Joan Tronto, a feminist who speaks about how we need to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. That's certainly something I think that also speaks to ecofeminism, although I don't think Joan Tronto would define herself as an ecofeminist as much as in a similar way that I don't. So that's sorry. What I wanted to finish with was not, well, I've put all my references there if you'd like to look those up. But basically, I'm also appealing, I think to others who are now living here in Europe, is that finding emotional resilience instead of guilt, and learning how to witness suffering without being incapacitated, and acting with others in solidarity and collective learning rather than loneliness is the main challenge that we need to be taking up. Because as I say, and as I feel, we really do live in a world of loss and despair. And we need to learn how to embrace those changes, and embracing those changes, live for what is possible, expressing compassion rather than just empathy, and to seek to live a simpler form of modernity based on these notions of commoning, of commons, find these convivial technologies based on diverse needs, and this radical imagination that acknowledges that we might live with deep fears and worries about the future, but that we're able to overcome that through radical hope. Okay, so thank you very much. That's what I wanted to share with you. And I hope that we can now have an interesting dialogue with everyone.
Yeah, wow, thank you so much, Wendy. I'm very, very impressed, and that I think the same goes for the whole lecture crew. And yeah, we were very, very happy that you came to us. And in the meantime, lots of questions have popped up, and I'm very happy that we now can have a conversation on those. And it would be, of course, much nicer if we could all be sitting in the lecture hall in Hamburg. Yeah, we had some questions that are more questions of understanding, but we also have several questions that are more themed on different forms of, like, radical transformation, justice, what you mean with hope, and so on. But I think I'll just start with a few introductory points so that we're sure that everybody here in the crowd is still with us. Yeah, well, as a first pointer, I think it would be maybe good to hear in a nutshell what you would mean by ecofeminism.
Okay, so I answered that. Okay, so ecofeminism is it's a body of work and practice that is really looking at women as the essential subject of concern, and the oppression of women, and that's linked often to the oppression of nature as well. So it's a concern about how women and nature have been oppressed, I guess, by patriarchy and by capitalism, and that the idea of ecofeminism is to be really moving into another way of living, but usually by re-signify. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if this is too theoretical, but re-signifying the notion of what it is to be a woman, or what nature is. So for me, in my way of thinking, it can be too essentialist in that it's looking at women, as because they bear children, being closer to nature, and to some extent it sees nature as far away from culture, whereas I would say that nature and culture really co-constitute one another, and that there is no essential woman. There are many different sorts of women, and that's why I use the term gender, which is much more fluid and allows for not just men and women, but all sorts of genders in between. And I think that's why I am hesitant to talk about myself as a ecofeminist. Having said that, there are some brilliant, and I've mentioned some of them, brilliant ecofeminists that would also probably share the sense of more fluid sense of, not so sure about the sexuality part, but certainly would see nature as maybe not so static and far away from culture. I don't know if that's a neat synthetic understanding, but what you can hear is not so much, I would say there is a need to understand also that ecofeminism can be very effective in the political world. It's much clearer that way. People like Vandana Shiva, who's an Indian ecofeminist, stands up in all sorts of arenas and is listened to because she also speaks on behalf of women farmers, on behalf of seeds, on behalf of life, in a sense, and is really listened to in a way that if someone perhaps like myself would not be so listened to because I'm more nuanced, it's a bit more messy, it's a bit more complex. I'm saying yes, but there's socioeconomic relations, and then there's all sorts of queering of what's gender, and nature culture is really a concept that comes from Donna Haraway, much more scientific studies, or socio-natures from people like Andrea Nightingale, much more academic. So maybe that's also something to say that ecofeminism is politically often very persuasive, but within the field of academe, perhaps less so.
Yeah, thank you so much for summing this up brilliantly. I mean, I had my own trouble with ecofeminism because I label myself as queer. So that's why I always found the concept on the one hand very powerful, and on the other side very, very difficult. But I would say that the whole bunch of literature on new materialism has helped us very much to come across that and also to broaden the view. Well, I mean, quite closely related to that, I was wondering, I mean, when we were listening to your talk, one could of course say, yeah, well, but we in the West, everybody is a feminist now. So, I mean, how would you say, how is Western liberal feminism detrimental or maybe even ignorant to nature's destruction? What's the problem with Western feminism about that? Why doesn't that solve the question?
Well, you said it yourself. Well, first of all, there's many forms of feminism, and it's like Marxism, I suppose. There's sort of this generic label, but then there are very different ways people have interpreted it. So neoliberal feminist, or even, Beyonce feminism or whatever, I think it is important. It is popular culture. It's pointing out that, women, girls can do things that even a few decades ago people would say it was not possible because of their biology. So in that sense, I think there is an important recognition of the glass ceiling, etc. But that's a very neoliberal within capitalist terms. And I think what I've tried to establish is that climate crisis is about a capitalist system. It's about the ways in which people have objectified the environment. And it is also obscuring all the different power relations that impact all of us in different ways. So that neoliberal or liberal feminism is really about the individual self, whereas I'm arguing about the need for the collective change. And I'm also saying that there's economic and social relations which need to change. Not just joining and being like a billionaire Beyonce is part of the system. And even though she might put feminism in lights and whatever, for me, that's not the feminism that I'm talking about, which is the need for transition and change. And that's not that, and definitely, of course, we're really talking about not just women here, we're talking about everybody needing to change. So this idea of care, which is a political idea of care, of course, but the idea is that is not caring for yourself and needing to get up in the lights and become a outspoken feminist. I'm surprised you say you think everybody's feminist. I would say that everybody has heard of feminism and sees it, but doesn't necessarily relate to it as a term at all, partly because it's been, I would say, it's being depoliticized through images such as, I don't know why I've got Beyonce on my own, but that sort of stuck, that there can be numerous, that just for now I'm talking about her there's this image in my mind of her with this light saying feminist, whatever. I mean, you can buy apparently t-shirts that say I am a feminist by Christian Dior that cost €6,000. This is not the sort of feminism that I'm talking about. but at the same time, you're right, this is a very Western kind of idea, a very privileged one, maybe not Western, just a very privileged idea of what is a feminist. And you're right that we need to kind of maybe take it apart a little bit and think about, is that a useful term in other contexts? And there have definitely in Latin America, people are talking about the coloniality of gender and the need to see that that has imposed a particular idea of gender, feminism, I mean, a particular idea of gender, which is just as colonizing as others, and that we need to see other forms of gender relations, not necessarily gendered at all, but in different sorts of hierarchies or different ways of relating rather.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm a little biased because I'm living in my feminist bubble, but yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that we see a kind of sellout of feminist tropes and terms. Before we come to the point of care and hope, I've still one more point related to the green economy, because during your talk, you had a very interesting quote saying, "Women are being retold in a new narrative." And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that, because I guess it's the kind of narrative that consider women as the new and exciting resource whose potentials as green entrepreneurs can be tapped. And I guess for us as climate activists, it's important to detect these green economy narratives kicking in and also incorporating feminism. And I assume that we can see lots and lots of this imaginary at the COP26 as well, especially as we will now see so many nice and shiny financial tools coming out of the COP. So maybe you have already detected some kind of these new feminist green narratives.
Well, I was quoting Krista Victorit, who has been looking at that, and she in this sort of critique of the green economy, and also Giovanna Di Chiro, who has also looked at that. Giovanna is based in the States. And I think these sorts of critiques of the, as you say, the entrepreneurial, savior of the environment through micro enterprise, or through being able to manage things in ways that is seen as saving the environment. But at the same time, I haven't studied this, but I think it's definitely a narrative they've pointed to and questioned. This financialization of nature, though, I don't think is, of course, to any benefit of these smallholder farmers. I think that's the storyline. But of course, it's sort of business as usual, basically, from the point of view of the financial capital, and that's not in the global south. That's, of course, being managed in the global north, or the sort of supranational groups that we often don't see. And you did see in the COP that those were the people that were determining, right, a lot of the agenda, as far as I could see from the critiques. But having said all of that, and I'm going to say something fairly, I was trying to talk about positive stories. So I think that at the same time, and I don't know if you would agree with this, the sort of young people's voices were being heard there. And this is the generational narrative is also very interesting, that young people are the ones who are coming out with the strong critiques, and maybe that's a space where people find some positive hope. I think people struggling on to make ends meet get taken into all sorts of narratives, and it sounds like I'm talking fairy tales. These are not narratives without material meaning, right? These are really difficult stories, and I'm part of a project where a lot of the PhDs are looking at just how destructive these green economy narratives are for smallholders who think that they're getting into something positive, but sort of from the plantation to these little tiny holdings, and actually they're getting there's all sorts of major problems in terms of debt now for those smallholder communities.
Yeah, I totally agree. And for now, I'd, as you've already said, like to move over to the more positive sides and to things that we can do in the stories that we can recreate. Several of our participants found the points that you mentioned about care very exciting, and however, there were several questions wondering what exactly could be the collective arrangements of care which we need. Maybe you could come up with an example what a kind of care arrangement that may be. So what kind of new relations do we need, and how can we enter them, and how can we create them as activists and nature lovers?
Yeah, so I think it's also creating communities of care, right? So it's also a matter of saying that we're able to do, you see this, market gardens, urban gardens, you see that in many places. You see people who are working in neighborhoods and creating also, sharing resources, sharing whether it's clothes or food. You see waste, people who are collecting waste and doing kitchens where they're then either giving it away or providing it for people who will pay a small sum. So instead of relying on state, actually working communities and creating those possibilities to be in place with others. And I see that here in The Hague. When we did this Caring Communities conference for radical change, there were many amazing stories actually of people. One group had saved forests from an airport in France. I mean, there's sort of major heroic stories to all the squatting that goes on with the gentrification in Amsterdam, for example. People are still working to make communities in houses in buildings that have been squatted, and then it goes down to just stories of I'm thinking here of European stories, but of sharing food, sharing laundry. I mean, people actually sharing resources and thinking together that aging people, there's a community here of older people who are also moving into a place together so that they grow old together and work in a community at that point. I'm running out of, there are these sorts of stories also of refugee and migrant centers working with sharing resources, teaching language, people who need language skills, people who need, again, clothes and food. I think there are many, many stories around, and that's the point. I think COVID times also brought out that, right? People started to work much more with their neighbors and know who their neighbors were, even in these big... these, as I say, it's positive stories that we're looking for and collecting. And I should mention also, perhaps that's also what I meant by not only relying on these sort of descriptive or journalistic or anecdotal stories, but also imagination, like people, artwork, lots of things like that for me is also very important. That people are also going beyond just the telling of stories, but also doing things together in terms of art and different images about how they imagine the world together. I think that's also another invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this together in that way. As I'm sure that many folks here would like to see some collection of specific German examples, I've just put 2 literature tips into the chat. One is by Friederike Habermann, Halbinseln gegen den Strom. It's a book that sums up lots and lots of examples of commoning, urban gardening, and urban housing, and so on. And another that I put in are the works of Silke Helfrich. Silke Helfrich does a lot of work on commoning and also in common gardening. And she unfortunately died about 10 days ago during a hike. And she has come up with lots and lots of very both theoretical and very concrete work on how a different economy that's not based on competition, but on mutual care and collectivity could be achieved and could be transformed right now and right in this place. So that's so for anybody who wants to read about these thoughts in German, maybe just have a look at the chat. Yeah. One personal question for me, but also a question of clarification by others has been the questions what care relations mean in terms of our own position as human beings, because thinking of new care arrangements of course also implies decentering us as humans and moving beyond an anthropocentric point of view. And I guess during your talk, you mentioned the term more than human perspectives, which is a term that may be quite new to some of us. So maybe you could also elaborate on a bit what that means to move beyond our anthropocentric view, what we lose by doing so, and what we might even gain. And maybe also what the boundaries are.
It's interesting you put about what we lose. I think it's what we gain, in that we're just one of many species, and we're losing through climate crisis so much biodiversity, and we're also losing huge amounts of knowledge as well, and the ways in which we relate to ourselves is also via all these more than human. So if you think of the coronavirus, that showed us very well how the more than human links us, is part of us, relates to us. So it's not that we sort of lose anything, we just become more aware of how we're interconnected with all the other species. And I don't just mean what Donna Haraway calls companion species, a dog or a cat. I mean all species. I mean, we are codependent on many species. And if anything, I mean, the cruelty that we have just seen as normal. I mean, it's apparently normal that we put other species into factories, in order to be fattened up and killed for us to eat. We've totally not thought through the rights of those species and I'm not talking about food to live, but we're talking about huge industries that have destroyed not only animals, but also acres. I mean, all the land and the soils and the rivers. We've depleted so much of nature in the name of what we human needs. So I think it's not a loss. We would gain so much if we recognized other species and all of its complexity. Because that's also the quote by Joan Tronto. We need to do that. We're in a complex web of relations, not only human relations. She means all species relations. And the same with Mireille Puig de la Casa. She's also talking about the importance of soil. That's fundamental to our world. And we're not even seeing the destruction we're doing as we use sand to produce all sorts of cement and all sorts of crazy architecture. So actually, I think it's a gain, and we might find we're able to live a much more easy life if we move to a different world based on care. I don't say we just move overnight, but we build relationships of care that start to make us realize the exploitative and oppressive and violent way that we've been living. It is quite a lot of, when I say loss, I don't mean loss of our humanity, I mean loss of other more than humans. And I mean loss of cultures in all its meaning, cultures of bees, cultures of all the plants and animals that are extinct, all the insects we've lost. I think this is what we're also seeing with climate crisis. It's a crisis of a huge dimension, and I think we all can feel it. Now, COVID forced us to see what it meant, how bad it has been. And I think it shone a bright light on the problem of capitalism. So I think in that sense, this isn't a loss. This is a necessary step to really move to another way of seeing and recognize other forms of knowledge. It's not easy at all. I'm talking about this. I don't know what it means either. This is very uncertain because I also have to unlearn so much of what I thought was the right thing, including as a feminist, that I should become a professor. I should, own a house. I should do this. And then you realize all the implications of that. And that's very difficult And that's why it's collective. It's not just the individual. We have to talk and think these things through. Exactly why this kind of, these sorts of, well, not my talk, but just these kinds of moments where we create a community of learning where we try to come to grips with these things and think through many different ways. It's a rethinking of how we can cope with definitely the crisis that we're living through.
Yeah, I find it very important that you also speak of the bodies of knowledge that we now would take into account by overcoming anthropocentrism, because as Tom van Doren has, for example, pointed out, every time a species dies out, it's not just a species that is lost. We're not just losing the panda bears, we're also losing a complex net of relations, and we're also losing a lot of ecological knowledge. And I think it's very important to also speak of that, because this allows us also overcoming our understanding of epistemology as something science-based, and enter a new world of very new and new bodies of knowledge that are very difficult to grasp for us as human beings.
Having said that, although I think we have to look at science and whose knowledge and who counts and what the hierarchies of knowledge are definitely there. But still, when I talk to natural scientists, they're very, very much decentered humanity. They're very aware of species loss and what's happening to the oceans and to land, etc. And I think that's one thing for me, that we need to learn language, other sorts of languages also, not only other species or other cultures' language, but even, at least maybe I'm just speaking, I don't know, maybe all of you do that, but I find it very difficult to be speaking to people who don't agree with me. So I feel like I have to learn how to speak differently and how to listen differently, not only to, as I was trying to underline, in a decolonial way, to the erasure and loss of other cultures, but also to people who don't share our points of view, and to learn, this is what I mean, emotional resilience, because I think we also have to be resilient to deal with people who don't follow what we think, and then learn how to work and talk with them. And I think that's also another challenge. It's not exactly other languages, but other points of view, because we can't, you made me think that because you were saying my feminist bubble. I kind of think that that's true. We need to get out of those bubbles if we are going to find collective care, because it's all our responsibilities. It's not just feminists who care, or I don't know, climate activists who care. It has to be everybody who cares.
Yeah, I mean, that brings us again also to questions of allyship and how this kind of allyship can work. I mean, what do we need to cross boundaries, for example, to incorporate different classes, or what can we as northern climate activists learn from southern struggles, and what you think is needed to even strengthen our transnational solidarity?
I think it's maybe, creating spaces where you can learn from one another. But I think it's maybe not so much I think we need to work hard to take our own responsibilities and learn our own histories and what's produced the privileges that we lead, in order to also then recognize, as I said, in this pluriversal way, other knowledges, right? So it's a difficult one, because you need to sort of step back and listen as much as go forward and do your thing, right? Because the way we have been doing our thing in many ways has created these horrific ecological footprints. And I speak here about myself in that I, traveled a lot to learn from other places, but maybe the point is we need to learn very, very well about what we're doing and what's happening in our place and how to change that, and be in conversation with others, humbly learning that we've actually kind of made a mess of things, but not with this sense of guilt, just saying, okay, that's what it is. So how do we move forward with all these positive stories, and what does care mean for this? So I kind of used to think, we should all be, I've been in all these big international, transnational meetings with that idea that you would learn, but in the end, the hierarchies are there, and we're part of the hierarchies, right? So I think we have to unlearn how we go into those spaces, how we go in allyship and with humbleness, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed on your slides that you also showed a feminist Zapatista collective, and I was just wondering what made you put this lovely picture of these powerful Zapatistas on it, and what can we particularly learn from their struggles?
Well, yeah, that's because the Zapatistas, as you probably know, have been traveling Europe at the moment as an action to also tell their story, literally tell their stories of, and the ones that came to ISS came twice actually. One was to meet different particular groups, but one was a public event where they told their story of how a very different form of governance really, and what it meant in 1992 when the world was talking about, Columbus discovering America, and the Zapatistas were walking to Mexico City to reveal the kinds of oppression that this so-called discovery was about, and to say there's nothing discovered. We come from, very different histories and cultures which have been erased by this narrative of Columbus. But they also talked about how they have really stepped away from the mainstream national government of Mexico and have created in Chiapas a very different form of collective living. And the people who were speaking to us were the next generation, not the first generation. So they told the stories of their grandparents and parents and themselves. So it was a very powerful story. But the point was that they were coming to say, learn from this story, we could create a different form of governance. We could honor these histories. And we are not poor people. We are people with our agency, our politics, our strength. And we are, in allyship with you or in solidarity with you. And it was like that. It was describing a story that then which was very moving, but a completely different history than the modern national state of Mexico, and a very different history from the notion of, being discovered by Columbus or whatever. So yeah, that's very powerful. And those images, I think the Zapatistas have inspired a lot of people, and they're also a bit tired, I think, of being rediscovered by activists all the time, going to St. Cristobal and kind of living the life here. So it was kind of a big act that they came to Europe and said, okay, here we are, these are our stories, learn from us.
Yeah, it's totally true. And I guess they have in fact been overwhelmed by way too many social scientists that wanted to go there. But that's why it's a pleasure that they are, I guess, as I've heard, they will now plan to come to Europe frequently. So whoever hasn't had the possibility of an encounter may maybe have a chance in the next years to come, because they want to come to Europe on a regular basis and have this kind of intercambio exchange. Yeah. So that would definitely be something that will be of great importance for our movements and also for forms of climate change solidarity, I guess. Yeah, and I mean, as we are coming now to the end of our talk, I'd once again come to the points that you raised regarding radical hope. Yeah, I mean, climate grief has become an important and gruesome issue, and I mean, many of the participants here are just in their early 20s, or sometimes even just 17, 18, or 19. So it's, of course, an important thing to work through the grief and despair and be able to overcome it. But on the other side, also to be able to express these feelings. This has also become very important for me as a scientist. And I realized that more and more of the articles I'm writing with a full firework of emotions in my head. And but I think it has to be like that. And on the other hand, I'm also wondering, how can we work our way through that kind of grief and despair, and what forms of mourning will we need?
Well, I suppose XR has sort of personified or performed the mourning, right? So, and I think there's many performances of that. So I think that's important. There's, as I said, art, theatre, music, which helps us express all this grief. I think we don't have to do it always in words, certainly not always in academic articles. But I think there are ways in which what I was trying to say is that compassion, so rather than empathy, so compassion means embodying what you are feeling. And probably maybe we do need to have moments of just pausing and feeling the grief, but we can move on, because again, for me, what gives me hope is the idea that it's not just me individually, it's collective, right? We can share this. What is difficult for me, and I'm older, I think, and certainly Francisca, than you, and maybe, I don't know if I'm in conversation with my daughters who are in maybe the age group you've just described, and that's where I also feel there is a sort of generational difference, in that I grew up as an environmental activist thinking there was possibilities, or as someone talking about justice, where I thought that things could change. And I think that's what I want young people now to feel too. Things can change. It's possible. It's not that it's all completely lost, right? And I think that these narratives of gloom and despair we feel, absolutely, but at least we can recognize that it's a shared thing, and that our mental health depends on talking and sharing and being with it. And maybe there might be some ritualized ways. Maybe I listened to, or was talking to one person who said every day she tears up a small piece of paper, writes something on it and puts it in a jar, just to kind of to get it away, but sort of physically to get it away. That doesn't necessarily appeal to me, but I think the intentionality of that does. And also definitely learning from other cosmologies about how to deal with grief and loss. Maybe moving away from the angst that we get told is how to behave. And maybe, as you say, allowing emotions to play a part in all of this. So that's why I talk about emotional resilience, which maybe is just a catchword, I don't know. But I just find it appealing as the idea that I can be emotional, but I can be resilient with it. And I certainly want to move away from guilt, but I want to act on it. So this radical hope, it's not that you just sort of say, I hope everything's going to get better, but rather I'm going to act on it and be part of that change. So that to be the part of, embody the change that you want it to be. So that's where I talked about prefigurative politics. You live the way you want things to be. Yeah. Not easy, of course, but for me, it's really good, for example, that people speak about mental health as a major issue as well. So that it's not just that's also opening up a little bit more to maybe psychological or other ways of understanding emotions. I come from a generation where that's difficult to do, but maybe in that sense, ecofeminism with some of its more ritualistic forms could be quite interesting. I know La Via Campesina does, for example, quite a bit of ceremonial sort of openings and of their encounters, etc. So, yeah, maybe we have to explore and not be afraid of moving beyond the rational in that sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that was one of the most important, also most moving points of your lecture. And I mean, I would also personally say, as an activist in my first years, in my 20s, there wasn't any space for these kind of emotions in our social movements, because it was just all activism, action, campaigning, and so on, but no room for these spaces of grief and despair. And I think this has changed very much in the last couple of years, and I'm very relieved about that, because I think we need this kind of radical hope in order to be activists also in the next 10, 20, 30 years to come, because otherwise activist trauma or climate burnout will be all too problematic, and we need to protect ourselves so that we are able to fight these fights for the future and also for the present. Also, I guess issues like that will play an important role in our last lecture, which will be hosted by a psychologist for future, And many of them are also based in Hamburg. So I guess this will again be a point that we will refer to when we meet again here for the last lecture in this semester, or maybe also in the coming semesters. Yeah, so much for that. It has been a real pleasure that we could have you here, Wendy, and I'm very, very happy that you came. And I guess this was a very important lecture for everybody of us. And I'm also very happy that it will be still available via YouTube so that people can still have a chance to listen to your seminal words. Thank you very much. And we're happy to have a brief debriefing chat afterwards. And yeah, for everybody else, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and we will see each other again on next Tuesday. And stay healthy, and yeah, see you again. Bye.
Thank you very much.